Welcome to the CES 2022 Annual Energy Seminar. We're psyched that so many of you could join us today and add another Zoom meeting to your calendars. My name is Andrew Price. I'm President and COO of Competitive Energy Services. I'm going to kick us off today. We do have a full agenda. We're going to do our best to make this time useful and worthwhile for you. And you can help us out in that regard by asking lots of good questions. Before you look for your unmute button, let me tell you, you don't have one. Everybody's microphones are permanently muted for this seminar. It's not that we don't want to hear from you, we just don't want to hear from your pets, your cell phones, your coworkers. So I'm sure we've all been on those Zoom calls where there's a lot of background noise. To ask your questions, look at the bottom of your screen. You should find a Q&A button, also a chat button. Our preference is for you to submit questions using the Q&A, but if you make a mistake and use the chat, we'll get those and respond either way. We may hold the energy-related questions until the end when we have a Q&A period. We should have plenty of time to get to those. If you have a technical related question, we'll of course try to get to that sooner. I'm going to anticipate the first question that many of you might have. Yes, the seminar is being recorded, and we will share a link to everybody who's registered as soon as that's available. With that, I'm going to jump in and give you a brief overview of the agenda today. I'm going to start with a little bit of an overview of competitive energy services in case there are a few of you who are less familiar with us. And then we're going to jump right into energy markets. Here in the Northeast, we're more dependent upon world markets and world events than we ever have been in the past. And so we're going to spend some time exploring what's going on around the world, how that's impacting us here in the Northeast, how it's impacting our liquid fuel prices, our natural gas prices, and our electricity prices. And we'll get into some good detail there. We're going to briefly have an intermission of sorts to discuss some key takeaways from that section. And we also have some giveaways that we're planning to announce. So add a little bit of excitement to the middle of the seminar here. And then finally, we're going to do a focused session on ISO New England, on the New England power grid that's changing quite rapidly as we interconnect a lot of variable renewable resources to the grid and disconnect a lot of our legacy fossil plants. So we're just going to take a look at that future grid and how it might evolve and how it might impact you. And then again, we'll have time for Q&A at the end. So briefly about Competitive Energy Services, we are a full-service energy advisory firm. We've been headquartered in Portland, Maine for over 22 years now. We have offices, an office in Topsfield, Mass, and staff in 6 different states. We've got clients across the United States and into Atlantic Canada. The most important thing to know about us, though, is that we only work for end users. That means we're always 100% supplier neutral and product neutral. Of course, we're always transparent with our fees, and we have very customized energy solutions. With many of you, we work on your energy procurement. That is our continuous market monitoring services, our RFP management services, our bid and product analysis, and contract negotiations, and the often overlooked but very important post-contract management. When issues come up, we're still around to help you resolve them. We also have a number of discrete consulting services that we provide. I'm going to highlight several of these here in a moment. And for several of our largest clients, we have what we call a full service category, where we're really customizing the procurement related services and the consulting related services that make sense for that particular client, typically combined with our detailed energy budgeting service, along with our variance tracker, where we're comparing actual utility expenses throughout the year to the budget. I did want to highlight just a few of the things we've been working on over the past 12 months that you may be interested in. The first one is solar PV. We're involved in solar PV projects in at least 10 different states, but far and away the state that's been keeping us most busy here of late is the state of Maine. That's thanks to the state's net energy billing program. Over the past 12 plus months, we've been involved with and continue to be involved with about 100 different unique projects. In total, it's about 300 megawatts of new solar capacity. It's mostly solar capacity. There's some small wind and hydro mixed in there as well. But it's really a significant effort and a significant benefit to many of our clients who have been fortunate enough to subscribe. Wherever we work on solar across the US, there are a few situations that are going to look quite as attractive as the one I'm showing on the screen here. This project is in Bethel, Maine. It's one of the first net energy billing projects that we had come online. And to give you some reference on the scale, this is a 5 megawatt project. And if you look down the lower right of your screen, you can see some cars and a couple of utility trailers for reference on size. Greenhouse gas inventory work is something we've been engaged in for many years. But what struck us as different over the past 12 months is how it's really moving out of the higher ed sector and the high tech sector to really all sectors of the economy. We're seeing a lot of interest in healthcare, retail, manufacturing, as the importance of having a greenhouse gas inventory and tracking it over time flows through the economy. We're also engaged with a number of our larger institutional clients in the next step, which is often an energy and sustainability master planning exercise, where the institution is really looking at what their energy needs are likely to be down the road over the next 10 to 20 years. And we're helping them evaluate alternatives to meet those energy needs and rank those alternatives based on factors including cost, reliability, and of course, sustainability, and helping them put in place a roadmap to get from point A, where they are today, to point B, where they want to be in 10 to 20 years. The final thing that we've been working on over the past 12 months that we're excited about is battery storage, at least that I wanted to highlight today. Battery storage. Batteries are still very expensive, but we're starting to see in several locations the right combination of factors to make battery storage work. Those factors that are needed include incentives, the right utility tariff, and the right client load profile. We've got a number of projects up and operating in Massachusetts where those factors exist, and those have been very successful. And we're following a number of other states that we expect could have opportunities in the next 12 to 24 months, including the state of Maine. With that, we're going to jump in and start talking about energy prices. I'm going to show you in quick succession here 3 different charts, all showing you the forward 12-month strip of a different energy commodity. The first one here is natural gas. What I mean by forward 12-month strip is that every point on this chart is showing you at that time, at that day, what it would have cost to purchase the forward 12 months. This, again, is natural gas. It's the NYMEX, the US benchmark price for natural gas. And what I wanted to highlight here is over the past 12 months, running back to June 2021 and through May of this year, how that price has changed from $3 per million BTU in June of 2021 to more than $7 today. So we've seen a more than a doubling. I did advance the slide here, but won't blame you if you didn't really see a difference. This is electricity. You can tell because the units are different. But again, very similar profile in dollars per megawatt hour now. Where prices have gone from $40 in June of 2021 to north of $100 today. So well more than a doubling. And finally, heating oil and gasoline. These are wholesale prices. Not quite as steep a rise, but if I had taken this trend back a little bit farther, you would see that prices have increased from around $1.50 on a wholesale basis to the mid threes today, so pretty close to a doubling. So across all these fuels, we've seen prices up more than 100%. Of course, on a retail basis, if anyone's tried to fill a home heating oil tank recently, you've seen prices around $6 a gallon. And I believe that now in every US state, gasoline prices are at or above $4 a gallon. So retail prices are that much higher. So what's changed over the past 12 months? Why have we seen these pretty dramatic price increases? The obvious one is the pandemic. When the pandemic started, it absolutely collapsed demand, which took prices down. And as demand has come back, the production sources, the supply has really struggled to return to the levels it was at previously. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has had a big impact, scrambling world markets at a time when world demand for energy is high. That's really increased the demand for US exports. And finally, structural issues with the New England market are making the situation, that much worse for us here in New England. And we're going to delve into these issues in much more detail as we move forward with the presentation today. And the final thing, and finally getting around to the title or the theme of our seminar today, in northern New England states, there's long been a saying, probably in other parts of the country as well, but that there are really only two seasons, winter and July 4th. And it certainly seems that way these days with energy. I'm showing here is another way to look at natural gas pricing. So unlike the 12-month strip that I showed before, this is the prices on a single day, May 10th, and you can see what the price for natural gas was forward for every month out into the future, from June of this year out through June of 2027. And what really stands out, of course, is the winter. We see very modest pricing for the summer and shoulder months at $5 per MMBTU or less, but the winter pricing really goes through the roof. And so many people now are really just focused on how do I get through this winter, but as soon as they do, it's what do I do about next winter? So to get into what's happening around the world and how that's impacting us, I'm going to turn it over now to my colleagues.
Great, Andy, thank you. That was a great year in review. Welcome, everyone. Appreciate everybody joining. I'm guessing it's not a coincidence we have a record attendance today as people look to better understand this world energy shortage and the reason for these record high prices. We think understanding is critical to assessing your options and making the difficult decisions we're all going to have to make over the course of the next few years. I'm Keith Sampson, Senior Vice President of Energy Services, and I'm joined by Charlotte Delco, Energy Analyst. And for our section, we're going to focus on these world energy markets and their impact on New England. It's important to think about the big picture of worldwide energy commodities and what's happened over the past 3 years to cause commodities to increase by 300%. Prior to the pandemic, inventory was robust, prices were low. Natural gas hit a decade low in early 2020. But when the pandemic starts, prices plummet as traders sell oil due to concerns over falling demand. Oil companies and producers lose millions of dollars. And oil, natural gas, and coal production is cut. What happens next is markets begin to climb as traders fear production cuts will result in lower inventory. You can see this for both oil in orange and natural gas in green. And historically, coal, as shown in blue here, is the alternative to natural gas for electricity generation around the globe. With coal inventories declining and coal-fired generation retirements continuing due to the dirty and environmentally problematic nature of coal, this has put further pressure on natural gas and LNG across the world. Other world events that have occurred and weather events around the globe has added to this world energy commodity shortage, such as the Texas freeze and eventually the Russian invasion of Ukraine. With LNG being used to supplement world energy flows, and the landed prices for LNG have skyrocketed well above those of oil, natural gas, and coal. The solution to these high prices is increased production of natural gas, oil, and coal, in addition to a rebalancing of the world energy flows that have been so disrupted by the Russian energy sanctions. This slide shows the basics of supply and demand for natural gas, oil, and propane. Inventory levels compared to the 5-year average are represented by the blue bars on the left, and prices represented with the orange line on the right. This shows that as traders feared back in 2020, world inventories have fallen post-pandemic, and as a result, the prices have climbed. Andy alluded to it earlier, but if we roll the tape all the way back for 3 years, today, storage of natural gas is 22% below the 5-year average, and prices have increased from a low of $2 to a high of $8 today. Crude is a similar situation. The storage levels are 12% below the 5-year average, and we've seen almost a 300% price increase from $1 in April, right after that pandemic crash, all the way up to $4 today for crude oil. And propane, a similar story for those of us in the Northeast that use propane. We're 62% below the 5-year average for inventory. Prices have increased 300% from a March low of almost 26 cents on the Mount Belvieu to a high of $1.50 in April of 2022. In this seminar, we do talk a lot about LNG. I wanted to provide an overview of liquefied natural gas. LNG is generated when natural gas is liquefied through compression and cooling. Liquefaction facilities are expensive to build, super refrigerators that take 5 years to build and commission. New England imports LNG from Algeria and Trinidad. The Jones Act, unfortunately, requires shipments of goods produced in the US to be delivered on US flagged ships, and there are currently no US LNG tankers. An LNG supertanker like the one shown in this picture can carry roughly 3.5 billion cubic feet of natural gas equivalent. And this is enough to supply the country of Spain for a day, or nearly the entire UMass system for a year. In New England, we import LNG at terminals that are located in New Brunswick, Canada, and Everett, Massachusetts. In addition, the Northeast Gateway Deepwater Port, located 13 miles from shore in Massachusetts, is where you can see in the winter, you can see tankers offloading from Gloucester. This gateway was commissioned in 2008. It connects to the Algonquin transmission system in the North Shore of Massachusetts, and it's critical in the winter time for New England energy prices and New England energy availability. The exports are further to our south. Exporting facilities connect major interstate pipelines to liquefaction. As we go down the Northeast coast, the first is in Maryland, followed by another one in Savannah, Georgia. And then the balance of these LNG export facilities are located in Louisiana and Texas. And for more on the LNG story, I'll hand this off to Charlotte.
Thanks, Keith, for that overview. So keeping on the LNG theme, this graph depicts US to LNG imports to Europe, gas prices in blue, and then the exports in the orange line. So as demand has increased out of the pandemic, liquefied natural gas has become this highly requested commodity. And the situation in Ukraine is further exacerbating global demand, as Russia had been supplying approximately 70% of global imports. Exports to Europe are looking to further increase as the EU prepares to completely cut off Russia and their supplies. The US plans to export 50 billion cubic meters of LNG to Europe annually. Exports have grown significantly, as you can see on this graph, but we are reaching a problem. Production cannot keep up with the demand, and this problem will continue to grow, provoked by unusual weather patterns, especially unseasonably cool and hot temperatures in the spring and the fall. This next slide depicts this problem. The top graph depicts the US dry gas production in gray and the NYMEX natural gas price in blue. The bottom graph depicts rig counts broken up into oil and gas rigs. During the onset of the pandemic, production decreased as demand did as well. But while oil rig count in the US have been gradually rebuilding, gas has remained fairly flat, and thus production has remained flat as well. So the question is, why are new wells not being drilled despite prices skyrocketing? Producers are more focused on returning stable returns to their stakeholders rather than using their profits to invest in new wells. Further, rig count has remained fairly stable due to supply chain losses and lack of employment. As Keith mentioned previously, these super refrigerators for LNG take at least 5 years to build as well, which is holding up production. Thus, producers have been using already drilled wells in order to increase capacity. So what will happen when these wells get maxed out? While rig count has been trending upward in recent months, production numbers can take 12 to 18 months to catch up to new rigs being used. So it's likely that we will continue to see these high NYMEX prices until production is able to keep up with revitalized demand. For more on natural gas and its impacts on New England consumers, I'll pass it off to the next panelists.
Good afternoon. I am Chris Brooke, and Director of Natural Gas and Energy Services, and we'll be presenting the natural gas section with Aaron Rubin, one of our senior energy analysts here. I'm going to start with the pipeline slide. This is our natural gas pipeline system in New England. We are sitting on the most prolific shale play in the world with Marcellus and Utica in Appalachia. You can see the dark shaded area. However, there are constraints on the system, and as you move east towards 495 in Boston, we certainly have a lack of pipeline capacity. Because of this, New England is subject to high basis prices during the winter months. So in order for us to relieve those constraints, we're going to need to compete with Europe for winter LNG cargoes. And for context, the current LNG price in Europe is roughly $30 to $35 an MMBTU. This chart compares LNG imports to Algonquin spot prices. Algonquin is a primary liquidity point in New England. Typically, LNG injections have moderated spot prices historically. This past winter, however, LNG prices were significantly higher due to higher alternative fuel prices and to the fuel shortage in Europe and Asia, which we've discussed. There was less LNG injected into the system this past winter, but spot prices remained close to the price of oil, which is a key alternative fuel for fuel switching. The top chart compares LNG imports to Boston heating degree days. Now, on the coldest days, when degree days are high, New England relies on LNG to meet demand. And because LNG is brought in on ships, as Keith outlined, it is much more expensive than pipeline gas. Now, the bottom chart shows Algonquin spot prices over the winter months. And the key takeaway here is that New England pays a premium when LNG is imported into the region. Now for more on LNG, here is Aaron.
Thanks, Chris. So as you illustrated occurred this past winter, the expectation that New England will continue to rely on expensive liquefied natural gas exports on the coldest days of next winter as well has driven upward our future pricing for natural gas next winter in New England. This graph we're showing here shows where we see pricing for New England gas and European gas pricing trending for next winter. And you can see that while the upward price trend is not as severe in New England as in Europe, New England pricing has nonetheless gone up significantly in response to some of the energy shortages and higher prices we are seeing in Europe that have been discussed. This again speaks specifically to the shared reliance New England has with Europe on LNG cargo deliveries on cold winter days, which increases the New England market's exposure to the higher energy prices abroad, as our region of the US in particular needs to pay a competitive global market price in order to attract LNG cargoes that could otherwise sell to LNG import facilities in Europe. This susceptibility to increasing global LNG market prices is very unique to our region of the US, specifically due to the pipeline constraints New England deals with on these cold days, as Chris discussed. And as illustrated on the next slide here, higher LNG prices as a result specifically impact the basis component of gas pricing, which is the component that looks specifically at the differential between the price of gas in New England and the price of gas at our national pricing marker, NYMEX, at Henry Hub in Louisiana. On this slide, you can see how increases in global energy and LNG pricing has had a much more significant impact on New England pricing basis than on basis pricing at other nearby locations in New Jersey, New York, and Pennsylvania. In 2020, when global energy demand was relatively low and prices for global energy commodities was reduced, you can see that New England basis was only trading at a slight premium relative to these nearby basis locations. However, as the economy recovered and a general shortage of energy commodities emerged globally in 2021, you can see that the premium for the New England basis price shown here in blue significantly increased as the price of global LNG that New England has to uniquely use in the wintertime significantly increased over in Asia and Europe. The current war now in Ukraine has only further elevated New England basis pricing, with the expectation that prices for LNG will only stay high or increase with Europe's current tight gas storage inventories and desire to wean itself off of dependence on Russian gas imports. So to now discuss how rising New England natural gas prices have impacted our electricity pricing outlook, I'll be passing things off to our next set of presenters.
Thanks, Aaron. My name is Hannah Parks, and I'm an energy analyst at CES. We're going to look now at electricity and renewable markets in New England, beginning by reviewing the high electricity spot prices the region experienced this winter. Because typically over 50% of New England's power is supplied by generators burning natural gas, the price of natural gas sets the price of electricity here. As Chris and Aaron outlined, winter pipeline constraints forced New England to be reliant on injections of foreign LNG during periods of high demand. During these times, the limited supply of gas serves residential and commercial demand before supplying our power generators. When there is not sufficient gas supply, power generators will often practice fuel switching to burn oil that can be stored on site. You can see in the graph to the right that oil and coal generation, seen on the top, follows the same curve as demand, seen below in orange, throughout the winter. Because of how expensive natural gas was in New England this winter, it was often cheaper for generators burning oil to be dispatched before gas generators. The result was that this January, generators burning oil produced the most power they have in more than a decade, increasing regional power emissions by an estimated 51%. Looking now to future prices, we can see the rise in the natural gas market has significantly increased the future price of electricity. The price of calendar year strips has risen over the past year, but spiked in the past couple of months, along with natural gas, following the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which heavily impacted commodity prices globally. In the graph to the left, you can see how closely the near-term 2023 strip follows the same curve of the natural gas 12-month strip in orange below. The upcoming year is also observing the most significant price premium, with the cost more than doubling over the past year. Prices for 2024 and 2025 are continuing to climb, indicating that the current concerns surrounding gas supply in New England will not be resolved in the short term. Next, Jesse is going to take us through a closer look at specific pricing trends in New England.
Thanks, Hannah. My name is Jesse Newton, and I'm Associate Manager of Analytics at CES. Now, to answer this question of why New England electricity prices are uniquely high in the United States, it's useful to look more closely at seasonal trends in the futures market. On the right, the green line shows the price of purchasing a megawatt hour of electricity for the next 3 years in New England. And we compare that to purchasing the same amount of electricity in the mid-Atlantic, which is shown in this orange line here. Now, because of similarities in our power generation fleet, summer electricity prices are closely aligned, and winter electricity prices are more expensive for both regions because of heating demand. However, in New England, because of these pipeline constraints we've been discussing and expected reliance on foreign LNG, winter prices are much higher in New England for the next 3 winters, with prices ranging as high as $240 a megawatt hour next winter and $160 per megawatt hour for the next 3 years. And now in the mid-Atlantic, because of their pipeline infrastructure and ready access to gas from the Marcellus Shale, this winter price premium doesn't really extend out much beyond the next winter. If we go to the next slide, because of how volatile and expensive the gas and thus the electricity markets have been, our focus has really been on this, but energy piece is only one part of purchasing electricity in New England. In the graph on the left, you can see what the average annual cost to purchase a megawatt hour of electricity has been historically, and what we're projecting it will be for the next few years. Breaking this apart and starting with energy shown in the blue bars, these costs are projected to increase pretty substantially in the near term, driven by an increase in energy markets. Capacity costs, which are shown in orange, are the costs associated with New England's forward capacity market. This market is designed to guarantee that New England has sufficient power resources to meet consumer demand during the hottest and the coldest periods of the year. Now, these costs have been declining recently and are forecasted to stay low in the near term because New England currently has an excess of power resources. Going through the next few components, ancillary costs shown in the red bars is a small cost component paid to maintain grid stability and security. Fuel security costs are shown in the purple bars. These are costs paid to keep certain power generators online that have been deemed essential for grid reliability and they would otherwise close. Now, finally, renewable portfolio standard costs are shown in the green bars. Now, this is a growing cost component paid to support renewable energy development in the region. Renewable energy standards, portfolio standards, are state-specific and require energy suppliers to procure an increasing percentage of their electricity from renewable resources, and these costs are then passed on to consumers. The example on the left is for northeastern Massachusetts, and RPS costs for other regions in New England are generally a bit lower than what we're showing here. But bundled all together and with the current market, we forecast that electricity prices could increase by as much as 20% if next year before falling for the next 3 years. And next, we'll wrap our commodity section with some key takeaways.
Thanks, Jesse. Great presentations from everyone. So I now understand what we need to know to look ahead and think about the winter ahead of us. My name's Charlie Agnew. I'm the Managing Director of Energy Services here at CES. And I've got some takeaways from the presentations today just to recap. It seems to me a common theme is that we are short supplies of energy commodities as production has been slowly coming back up since the start of the pandemic, early 2020. We're seeing that these energy producers are cashing in on high prices today rather than storing these fuels for the delivery in the future, which challenges our storage picture, but is what you'd expect when those future prices are backwardized. They're less than today's spot market. So that's predictable. One of the outcomes of the Ukraine crisis is seemingly a need for more energy security and expansion of natural gas access and storage reserves for the European Union, excuse me, as these countries attempt to wean themselves off Russian gas and prepare for next winter, which that ripples back to us here in the US and New England. I heard the word unique. We are always unique and reliant on winter gas and electric prices that rise and fall with the cost of liquefied natural gas. So another unique cost and reliability concern for our dynamic New England market, which we love. So we'll talk a little bit more about strategy at the end of the presentations. That's what you're all here to learn about. But we do know that this market balance will take some time to resolve itself, and also that this upcoming winter is one to be especially mindful of. With that, I get to shift the presentation from markets to talk more about the New England energy grid of the future.
Hi, everyone. Evan Perkins here. I'm a vice president at CES. I run our consulting practice. Much of the discussion so far during this seminar has been about what has happened in energy markets over the last 12 months and what the short-term outlook in specifically New England's energy market looks like over the next 2 to 3 years. Obviously, the short-term focus is key for everyone here. That's going to significantly impact your energy costs in the near term. As part of these seminars, though, we also like to sort of take the lens a little further out and think about what's coming up, what's coming in the future. This year, we are thinking about what the power grid looks like and how the power grid is going to need to evolve over the next 10 to 20 years if we want to meet deep decarbonization goals in New England and across the country. As we think about these energy systems and this sort of shared infrastructure like the power grid, this infrastructure doesn't change overnight. So if we're going to plan a major transition in the way we source and deliver energy, well, we need to do this very thoughtfully and over a long period of time. Again, this doesn't happen overnight. So for this next section, we're going to talk a little bit about what ISO New England, they're the regional grid operator and planner here in New England, has been working on over the last 12 plus months focused on this issue. While we focus on New England, some of the concepts and key issues that we'll raise apply to other parts of the country as well. The fact that we have a lack of federal coordination and mandate on how the US is going to decarbonize the energy system we have that serves our economy to avoid the worst sort of consequences of climate change. That lack of coordination and driving is forcing states to sort of chart their own routes towards decarbonization. As these states rely on shared infrastructure that's regionally designed, we run into some tension, and that's what we'll focus on here with this ISO New England case. So what we have on the slide here, I'd first focus on the graph or figure we have on the left. This graph shows each of the 6 New England states and highlights some of the long-term decarbonization goals the states have that are economy-wide. Over the last 3 years, we've seen 5 of the 6 states, New Hampshire being the exception, either establish or greatly expand their long-term decarbonization targets, i.e. reducing economy-wide greenhouse gas emissions by a significant level, typically using a 1990 or around 2000 baseline. I think Massachusetts is a useful example to point to here. Last year in April 2021, Governor Baker signed into law the climate bill, SB 9. This is a really ambitious piece of legislation that basically legally mandates Massachusetts reduces its economy-wide emissions by at least 80% by 2050 compared to 1990 emissions levels, and then offsets the remaining 20% so that the state can be carbon neutral by the midpoint of the century. We have, like we show in the graph here, not only Massachusetts, but some of the other states, again, New Hampshire being the exception, also targeting this overall economy-wide emissions point of around 80% or more reduction level by 2050. And this is really requiring a fundamental overhaul of the energy system serving these states. The primary strategy we've seen that's emerged over the last couple of years of how these goals will actually become a reality, there's a growing consensus across the region of this notion called beneficial electrification. Beneficial electrification has two components. The first is that to move the bulk of emissions and energy sources to a clean, reliable source, there's first a need to transfer or transition infrastructure. So for Massachusetts today, for example, they've cut their emissions since 1990 by about a quarter. That's good progress through things like energy efficiency and the grid getting greener. But when we look at what needs to get done to move the state towards this 80% reduction target, what we're really talking about is going after oil and gas consumption, oil consumption in particular. Oil is about 60% of the state's emissions today. So to achieve this, we need to get things like vehicles over to electric vehicles. We need to phase out oil from the transportation system. We also, from the heating side, when we look at gas consumption in Massachusetts, there needs to be a push to move gas heating systems to electrified solutions. So again, this first component, how do we get fossil fuel, basically power technologies over to electrified solutions? The second component to achieve beneficial electrification is to make the grid greener. It doesn't do us much good if we shift technologies over to electric, but then don't have a clean generation mix. If the power plants upstream are still spewing a lot of carbon into the atmosphere, it's not a good way to achieve these 2050 goals. What we have on the figure on the right is showing, again, with the exception of New Hampshire in green, we have what the current state goals are across the other 5 states in the region for increasing the share of renewable energy and zero carbon generation in their electricity mix. So you can see a real strong trend, essentially increasing the requirements for having electricity come from sources like wind, like solar. Existing sources like nuclear and hydro also are important to this mix. But overall, again, we have to keep cleaning up the generation mix to be able to actually achieve these long-term targets. If we think about this graph here, again, we show each individual states and what they've set goals through either legislation or executive orders. These are state level goals. But what we're really talking about is a shared regional platform from which beneficial electrification is going to take place. If you think about the power grid and the way it was originally designed in New England, it's really a shared network. I'm going to keep coming back to that word network because it's important. Back in the mid 1960s, we built out this bulk power system. Think about high voltage transmission lines you see crossing the highway if you're driving throughout the region. We built out this high voltage transmission system in response to a region-wide power outage that was pretty damaging, and also then to connect nuclear plants, nuclear power stations across the region. So this is sort of like the interstate highway system. That's a good analogy to think of here. We've designed this electric grid that all 6 states share and that we need to think of as a single entity, in terms of how we generate and move power across the 6 states. Seeing as it is a shared resource, shared platform, we've set up this entity, ISO New England, as I'm going to call it the orchestra conductor. ISO New England runs the power grid. They're responsible for making sure the bulk power system stays reliable at all points, both in terms of how we generate power, but also how we move it around the region. They also wear a second hat as the planner of that grid. So in terms of making sure that as we look into the future, the transmission infrastructure and generation facilities are sufficient, both across summer and winter to generate power when we need it. That demand needs to be met in real time. And finally, ISO New England runs a single coordinated market for electricity across the region, both the energy market and capacity market that they run helps make sure that generators are compensated, for the energy and services they provide to the grid. So let's think about, we have all of these 6 states setting their own decarbonization goals, but if beneficial electrification is going to be the horse that they back to meet those goals, we really need to think about this as a single regional goal. How do we get decarbonization off of the same shared network that is the power grid? So if we take that view of the grid, what we have here in this graph is showing what each state currently takes off the grid. This is current electric usage across the year for each of the 6 states. So we have Massachusetts almost making up half of this annual electric use. We have Connecticut making up a decent slice here in black. And then the other 4 states, roughly 10% or less in terms of regional electric use. If we take this regional lens and say we have this single power grid, the question of where that generation is coming from is shown in this graph. Today, if you look at the generation mix, we have about 50% of our annual electricity being generated basically by natural gas. We really don't generate a lot with coal or oil yet, especially outside of those coldest days in the winter. The remaining 50% of our annual electricity is generated from, I'm going to call them zero carbon resources: nuclear, hydro, wind and solar. We have 2 remaining nuclear power plants in New England, Seabrook in New Hampshire and Millstone in Connecticut. These 2 plants are significant contributors to the amount of zero carbon generation we have. We have hydro generation, both in region dams, but also a significant amount of imported electricity from Hydro-Quebec to the north of us and New Brunswick. And for wind and solar, I think most might find this part of the graph surprising. Right now, wind and solar don't account for a large share of generation, but for what we expect new generation to be added to the grid, wind and solar are by far going to account for the largest share of that. So this slice is going to grow. If we, again, think about the grid today and then over the next 10 years, what the states currently are targeting is to have this share of zero carbon generation increase from roughly 50% to about 2/3, 67% by 2030. To achieve this, to get this light green slice coming from zero carbon resources, we're going to need to build new wind and solar, which the New England states individually have committed to do. We have the southern New England states now legally bound to develop about 7 gigawatts of offshore wind. We have Maine and a number of other states still driving significant solar development. So to get this pie increasing for renewable generation, the states have set up legislation and legal mandates to do so. If we stretch this outlook to 2040, right now, if you take these cumulative targets of zero carbon supply across the region, they add up to about 80% zero carbon generation by 2040. This graph is interesting. If you think about all the offshore wind that's going to be developed over the next decade off of Cape Cod, there's enough generation there, about 7 gigawatts, to actually get us to this point where we're at about 80% renewable. Just to put that in reference, 7 gigawatts of offshore wind, that has enough power capacity to power millions of homes across the region at the same time. We're talking 600 to 700 really large wind turbines being put out in the middle of the water. Each of these turbines is almost as high as the Hancock Tower in Boston. So really significant infrastructure being put off of Cape Cod to help achieve, this increasing share. Now we get to the elephant in the room here. So what we just said is that if you think of new wind and solar that's being planned and that's being driven by these individual states, it looks pretty good. We look like we're on a path to keep cutting into the share of fossil fuel generation onto the grid. If we go back to what beneficial electrification requires, though, it's not only getting zero carbon generation, it's adding all of these new electric load from things like electric vehicles and heat pumps. If we're going to cut into oil use and gas use across the region and come anywhere close to getting 80% emissions reductions by 2050, we have to add a really significant amount of load to the grid. For the example we're going to show here, we're going to talk about electric loads doubling. This number is sort of subject to dispute depending on how you look at it. We think at CES, for the region to achieve this roughly 80% emissions reduction target by 2050, we're talking about at a minimum a doubling of electric loads across the region. And this is annual electric use over the coming decades. If we factor in this component of added electric load, the point of what our current zero carbon generation gives us, it's a little more challenging. What we have today giving us about 50% zero carbon generation across the year, that gets diluted to about 25% if we have electric loads doubled and no new renewables added to the grid. And this just isn't going to work. So if we don't build new renewables, we are going to be powering this incremental electricity use from things like oil and natural gas, especially in the winter months. If you think about heat pumps adding load during the coldest days, the fact that we can't get enough gas into the region today, if we tried to run a grid like this in the future, you'd be burning oil. And what's the good of electrifying if that source is coming from oil? The good news is that we have a lot of new renewables being planned. Like I said before, the southern New England states are targeting about 7 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. The rest of the interconnection queue, this is projects that are being proposed to ISO New England for interconnection at some point in the future, is a lot bigger than that 7 gigawatts. We have over 18 gigawatts of wind currently in the queue being studied, over 4 gigawatts of solar. So this, if it all gets built, is going to really help us, cut into the share of fossil fuels even as we're adding electric load. But it's just not enough. What we show in this next graph is that if we double our electric use across the region by 2040, say, through these conversions of vehicles to electric vehicles and gas systems to heat pumps, we are still only about 2/3 of the way to zero carbon electricity. It's just not enough to meet the long-term 2050 targets once we incorporate this load. So the takeaway here is not to despair and to say we shouldn't do this at all. The takeaway really is, the current planning process and the pace at which we're adding zero carbon generation to the grid, it's just not enough if we're going to make these 2050 goals a reality. So all 6 states are really going to have to step on the gas to increase the pace of this transition if we have any hope of realizing these end goals through beneficial electrification. And that brings us sort of full circle to ISO New England. So again, ISO New England wears these different hats, but their overall marching order is to maintain a reliable grid and to manage these electricity markets in a reasonable way. ISO New England has realized and recognized this challenge, i.e., individual states going at this alone, trying to realize these long-term decarbonization targets each by themselves just doesn't work when we have a regionally networked grid, when we're all relying on the same platform here to move and generate power. So ISO New England over the last 12 plus months has conducted or kicked off a study process that really looks at the nitty-gritty of these challenges. There's 2 aspects of this study. The first is, how can ISO New England run a reliable grid in the future? If we add all of this intermittent wind and solar generation, which is required if we're going to successfully achieve beneficial electrification, how does the grid stay balanced and reliable, in the cases where the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow? There's going to need to be other resources, battery storage, gas, hydro. We need to think about this as a portfolio of resources that balances each other. So that reliable operations is the first goal. The second goal here is focused on markets. So ISO New England currently runs, again, our energy and capacity market in the region. This is the way generators get paid and the markets through which these new resources will participate, this new wind and solar. The question of how to maintain a market that pays resources in a way that balances or gives us the right mix of generation in the future. This is a real challenge as we really scale up wind and solar additions unless some market reform is put in place. So I'll say it before digging into this a bit further, thinking about what's come of this study so far. This is sort of an initial study process. These issues have not been resolved. It's really been about identifying the key issues and starting the conversation of how we solve this. We think here at CES, this is all going to hinge in particular on how we think about our transmission system serving the grid moving forward. What we show on this slide is the transmission system serving southern New England. If you think about these blue lines, they're the high voltage transmission lines that span the region. They deliver power today. If you think about these purple lines, these are potential landing points for offshore wind throughout southern New England. So you can see that they add up to about 15 gigawatts. The queue had about 18 gigawatts of wind. But there's a need to coordinate where and how we land this offshore wind onshore to make sure that we can put this into a grid in a way where we don't need to substantially overbuild. Think about this. This is sort of like a bunch of cars driving down to Cape Cod on a Friday afternoon. If we have a one-lane highway, you're going to run into bottlenecks. What we have here right now is a system that can't accommodate all of this wind coming onshore. So beefing up the transmission system once we get onshore and enabling that power to get to load centers like Boston, that needs to be a regionally coordinated process, not just individual states going at it by themselves. Once you get onshore, it doesn't get easier. We need to think about how we beef up these blue lines and probably have to add more blue lines here to move this power around the region, especially as demand and use increases when we're electrifying transportation and heating. The current transmission system is just not going to be good enough to reliably serve an electrified economy. These two issues get mixed even further when you think about who should pay for this. We have this electrified load increasing demand, requiring us to beef up these blue lines to move power around the region. If we also have to beef up these blue lines to get more offshore wind onshore, there's a gray area where you wonder who and how does this get paid for in a way where it can be developed quickly enough to actually make these goals be realized in a timely fashion. So this is a discussion and debate that's going to play out over the coming years. This is going to be a really contentious issue, how the transmission system gets planned, who controls it, how it gets paid for. But this is really going to be the crux of whether we can realize beneficial electrification or not. Just going back to the second component of ISO New England's study here, we wanted to talk a little bit about the market shortcomings today and why, if we add all of this new wind and solar, why the current way that ISO New England runs their markets just doesn't really work. If you think about how we have the generation fleet set up today, ISO New England every day runs generators in this order. We're going to call this our supply curve for the region. So ISO New England looks at what are the cheapest generators to run on a variable cost basis. So if you think about fuel costs for gas or oil compared to, say, hydro or wind and solar costs, which there's really no variable cost at all, ISO New England runs the energy market by first dispatching these resources that have little to no operating costs, and then going up the supply curve as demand increases, dispatching things like other hydro, gas. If we get into really high peak demand periods for the winter or the summer, we get into other resources like oil and coal. As we add new renewable generation to the mix, whether that's solar, whether that's offshore wind, whether that's Hydro-Quebec imports, the NECEC line, if that ever ends up getting built, what we have happen is the market supply curve, i.e. these next phase of generators that have higher variable costs, this curve gets shifted to the right. What happens here is that these generators in the middle, in particular the gas plants, don't get run as often. They still need to run in this future grid if the wind isn't blowing or the sun isn't shining and we're not getting renewable energy generation. They need to balance that intermittency. But across the year, they run less and less because these wind and solar resources in particular are running whenever they can. So the question of how they make enough money to stay online, it's a big question and one that hasn't been answered yet. These resources ultimately may have to exit the market if they're not receiving enough energy market revenues or capacity market revenues. There's the capacity market we could rely on too to make sure resources stay online. So again, there's this point of, as we saturate the market here with wind and solar, which we need to do to decarbonize the grid, how do we maintain a balanced generation portfolio that keeps the lights on, and then that can balance intermittency across how we're generating power? It's a really big, tough question that ISO New England is sort of trying to wrap their arms around. After the initial phase of this study that's been completed, there's been a couple ideas thrown out of potential market solutions that ISO New England could implement. These include implementing a carbon price on electricity. This would take the negative externalities of carbon from our fossil fuel generation and actually put them into electric prices, which from an economic perspective is a really efficient means of sending price signals to say lower emissions generation should be built over time. The challenge with carbon pricing is that if we only apply it to electricity, that will make electricity more expensive, but natural gas will sort of stay the same price, putting commodity volatility aside. Electrifying or incentivizing folks to electrify transportation and space heating, it becomes more challenging if electricity is more expensive. So there's some challenges of only implementing net carbon pricing on the electric sector. There's also an idea to expand the forward capacity market that ISO New England runs to think about procuring clean energy sort of capacity attributes on a forward basis. This is a more complicated structure that we'd be glad to talk with you in more detail offline. But at a high level, this notion of running a central auction that's competitive and that gives better forward transparency on pricing, that's an idea that's being sort of bandied about. And it might be a combination of these two elements to try to solve the issues we just ran through. Long term, or looking sort of what's the takeaway here, these again are issues that aren't going to be solved overnight. These concepts are being more fleshed out over the next 12 months. And if they ever get to the point where we think they may be implemented, we'll be talking with about these concepts and proposals with our clients to make sure you understand how you'd be paying for these proposals through your electricity supply pricing if they ever come to fruition. So what are the takeaways here? At a high level, I think it's important to recognize that if we're going to realize beneficial electrification as the means for each individual New England state to get to these 2050 emissions goals, we can't have states go about this themselves. You can't build the interstate highway state by state. It's interstate, it's in the name. We need to have a regional approach to this. We need regional coordination, and the pace at which we're thinking about this transition. If we're serious about reaching these 2050 goals, even though that's 30 years away, we have to put our foot in the gas and move on this quicker. So with that, we'll pass it back to Charlie for some wrap up, and look forward to the Q&A.
Thanks, Evan. You're getting plenty, so it'd be nice to say we could wrap things up, but I think you've stimulated a lot of good questions here. So I'll give you a minute to take a look through some of those and take a breath and do a little bit of a wrap up with Keith here and on the energy markets and commodities section, which have also led to questions primarily timing related and what should be employed for strategy here as we get into next winter. And one of the concepts here is the fact that the lack of storage and inventory right now is causing high prices, and these high prices then disincentivize storage, and this creates a bit of a cycle. And Keith, I think one of the questions to answer here would be, when is this cycle going to break? How long will it take for these commodity markets to correct as folks are looking out into next winter and beyond?
Yeah, Charlie, it's a great question. It's obviously many dollars worth of question, but I think it's reasonable to expect that it will take about the same amount of time to get back the inventory that we had or back the production that we had prior to the pandemic as it took to get to the spot that we are today. So if we assume that that took about 2 years, I think it's a pretty safe assumption that within the next 2 years, we'll start to see much more production and inventory levels become more reasonable and prices become more reasonable. I think right now the market is sort of underestimating the extent to which high prices will result in demand destruction, as well as the supply resources that will start to come to bear here, as essentially costs are about half of what they are, of what the prices are today. So, which sort of also is another interesting piece of another question that came in, Charlie, that I'll just take here, which is what is the cost of liquefaction and transportation? And so for LNG, the ballpark is $2 to liquefy and another couple of dollars for transportation and shipping. And so, at $30, it's quite profitable to take NYMEX at $7, $8 and sell it for 30. So that handled just sort of two questions. What do I do about 2023 renewals is really what many folks are asking today. And protecting against the winter is important. Everybody's risk tolerance and everybody's circumstance budget is a bit different, but we don't foresee locking all of 23 and beyond at this time. Some protection against further price escalation is maybe a good strategy. We can do layers and different types of tiered structures for strategies, but as we look towards the future, more oil production, more gas production, we believe that within the next year and a half, we'll see these prices start to decline.
So year and a half is a good chunk of time. We've got winter coming ahead of us here. Chris, from a gas perspective, we had a question come in about what's driving these winter prices. Is it basis? Is it the gas commodity? Talk us through some strategy on how to get through winter and what's driving these prices.
Yeah, thanks, Charlie. Basis in New England will impact the cost to generate electricity more in the winter months than in the non-heating season months. Winter months for the gas here are November through March. Summer is April through October. For context, the winter 22-23, the basis is about $14.50 for that strip, and the NYMEX, or the natural gas commodity component, is only $8.25. I say only, compared to the $14.50. So basis is a much bigger factor than NYMEX in the winter. The opposite is going to be true in the non-heating season months when we have ample capacity to meet that seasonal load.
Okay, that's helpful. We've mentioned in past years in having diversity and fuels and capability for load management during either, whether that's seasonally or hourly. These strategies have always been winners, but even more so relevant to note in these high-priced markets. That's even more valuable of a tool to deploy. Eben, I wanted to circle back because we had some good questions about New England and some of the electric load here. Now that you've had a chance to pause and look through these, a couple questions came in about nuclear, whether that was part of our energy mix or whether we might anticipate that as part of the energy mix, and some other reliability related questions on the decarbonization that you laid out.
Yeah, so let's start with nuclear. Nuclear and all the graphs we showed and all the figures sort of looking at the future, our assumption was that all of the existing nuclear capacity, at Seabrook and Millstone stays operating through at least 2050, which I think is a big question. There's a couple different units operating here. One of the units at Millstone is only licensed through 2035. It's a big question of how that relicensing period may go, since the plant will be quite old at that point in time. So we may realistically be losing a slice of Millstone in 2035. The other Millstone and Seabrook units are basically licensed out through 2050, but the question of whether the owners of those plants will want to continue operating them for financial reasons is going to be a big point of debate here in the coming years. Connecticut is already heavily supporting Millstone through an out-of-market contract that was established a couple of years ago. They're also buying a slice of the output from Seabrook at a determined price to try to sort of allay the financial concerns of NextEra, who owns that plant. So really, maintaining that slice of nuclear today as part of our zero carbon generation mix, it's a lot of renewables that would be needed to replace that sort of firm 24/7, 365 power from the nuclear plants, with things like intermittent wind and solar. So that's going to be a tough conversation across the region if the nuclear plant owners try to play chicken. Looking forward, building new nuclear, it's really hard. In the South, we have a couple new nuclear plants that are, I'm going to call them at the later stage of construction. In Georgia, we're now approaching, I think, $30 billion for a new nuclear plant that isn't even complete down there. So a new nuclear plant at real scale is extremely expensive, especially with the safety sort of precautions and infrastructure that's built in there. There are interesting modular nuclear plants, much smaller plants that are sort of the next wave of nuclear technology. Those are going to be piloted here over the next decade out west. But yeah, it's a big question mark. It's a reliable source of 24/7 clean energy. The question of how you build it economically and maintain it, it's going to be a sticky wicket. Just in terms of reliability, when we think about how the grid will run in the future, the pie charts we shared are a pretty simplistic view of sort of how energy is generated on an annual basis. On a day-to-day basis, if you think about when the sun shines or the wind blows, especially offshore, there needs to be significant new technology deployment to balance those resources. So in terms of how we'd actually harmonize all of this intermittent generation with demand, we need significant energy storage, so talking batteries. We need to probably have more hydro imports. We need to think about how gas plants are utilized during ramp periods in the evening. So there isn't a single sort of silver bullet to this. We're going to need a full toolkit to run this grid reliably in the future. And as we get to 80, 90% zero carbon generation, the question of how you phase out that last 10% of gas generation, it's really hard, thinking about how you reliably run the grid at that point without gas. But it's a challenge that the states are going to have to take on.
Thanks, Evan. We won't be able to answer all the questions today or even tomorrow, but we are here. Thanks everyone for joining the seminar today. We'll follow up where we missed some of your questions during the Q&A here. Thanks everyone. Enjoy the summer and beautiful weather here. We'll see you next year. Thanks.